Hello everyone, today we talk about late medieval armies collective training and more specifically of the historiographical problem behind the topic in itself, because as you know, as most things pre-industrial, and not even frankly, we do not know a great much, right? Especially from a strictly practical point of view, how armies were organized, how they were composed. You would expect that more or less digging in the sources, in archives, information comes out. Well, actually, there is some type of information that you never find, right? Just think that we have only one source in which we can read the composition of a single medieval army once in the 13th century. It's the only one existing ever, and it doesn't even explain, of course, how the army was actually eventually organized in a tactical function, and or whether the system was described was complete and so on. So that's basically how we get to medieval warfare, like by a big deal of speculation. Like most things historical, even when you scratch the bottom of the barrel, but you never find the actual cause consequence conjuncture that allows you to say, okay, well, we are certain, we're sure about this. Many people want to know history because they think that history is about learning with positivistic, progressistic perfection. And this is exactly the opposite of what history is, which, however, very often is also what they misinterpret as, okay, so you can't know anything, it's all relativism. No, you can start understanding things from a lot of hints, right, that do not make the truth, oh my god, the hard facts, what people, I always say, this thing that strikes me, how people Google, and every historical topic you find in the automatic searches of Google, whatever topic, facts, as if somebody was preventing you from knowing the truth, because there's a truth that you can reach and hold and grab and kiss and and gravitate and all of these things. But it doesn't really happen like that. The best thing you can do to know about the truth is that you can come closer to it by gradual steps of very extenuating, lifelong blood spitting and torrential sweating, let's say, that never ends, and yet you do just for the sake of it, basically, even though it does have, at the end of the day, a positive application. That's the only way, and there is no formula. That's an interesting side of the story. And militarily speaking, especially if you are a specialist in tactics, like I am, at least how I decided to be, and it's not even a compliment, because tactics is kind of the simplest aspect in many ways. It's very complex, as also the amount of stuff that I'm writing, and all the things that you think to know and that you dig on again, show you the complexity. Always nothing, for example, in comparison to strategy, which is also something that conceptually the average person cannot dominate, even if you explain what it is, right? They don't get to the scale what it is, and the incredible in fact, the impossibility of framing it in just a single explanation, a single article, and a single book, in something that really gives you back the full standard pack of positivistic knowledge about that. And one aspect, in fact, of the military art that for this reason fascinates us by various degrees, and that is arguably the most important, at least in a prescriptional phase. That is how armies were put together, were trained, prepared for their employment, etc. in combat, is really unknown, right? And it is one of those topics we could start those powerful digressions that never end, especially considering my bias, I must say, in a sense, but I think I have a point in that towards Reconstructionism altogether, whether it's HEMA or reenactment to core, whatever people think, any form of even movies or some scenes, etc., that are supposedly below in some historical accuracy. And what the hell does that even mean, considering that you already know that the people who do these things do not have a specialization in the art of war, and the specialization in the art of war is not what the average idiot invents it to be. It's a specific scientific field of polymological specialization that nobody gets, right? It's not that you know how you have welded weapons or you have dressed up in armor. That has anything to do with the art of war, right? That you don't even know what it is, and especially if you don't know what it is, it's because you haven't pictured the complexity of warfare in its entirety. for not talking about film producers and everything, always watch movies for their artistic values. If you want to know anything historical, make history, that is research. Not even read books or think that you can't, gnostically, be access to, a higher, superior qualitative knowledge that will give you, again, the illusion of the truth of whatever. The sheer scale of magnitudinal incompetence regarding any form of reconstruction that basically can see in popular culture at every level, including, again, the people who seemingly spend a lifetime doing this stuff, is appalling, to say the least, and shameful. Also considering that history is raped in the process, right? Not by, you see, again, the museum curator, the reenactor, these are not competent people, right? They're not people there that you should revere because they have any form of authority or competence. In order to do that, they must prove that in some way. I don't even tell you that being a PhD means anything, right? That doesn't even mean anything, because factually, even those are not good, right? And I'm one of them. So I'm warning you, because I'm telling you just how it is from the within. So in other words, never trust anyone. Of course, just you have to start somewhere, but be aware of the fact that there is always a narrative. Whatever you learn about, even in this video, there is a narrative, not just about this sermon at the beginning, because I like to get preachy and moralistic about these things, because it's objectively the standard mode you should enter in, right? You should basically teach yourself brutally to tear down anything you know, right? If you want to eventually know anything for sure. And that's what most people are not willing to do. They are attached to this false hopes, or say that whatever they think without any specific competence has to hold, and that's better than nothing, and going on with it, is maybe doing the thing. No, that's a pathetic, lame, dramatically unsatisfactory, and completely unscientifically and immoral. This is the point. It's immoral, because you're just, that you're lying to yourself. Like, if you don't know something, don't talk about that, right? It's that simple. That's why I tend to talk about things that I can dominate before, entering even in some degree of detail wherever I find them. And again, we all screw up, right? It's just about who screws less up at the end of the day. And that's how you should see the thing. And my point about this is, I get heated about this because, collective training is arguably the single most important thing that you should concentrate on properly in the theory of the art of war, for the positive application of military, of the same military art, right? That von Clausewitz even says properly, it's not really an art per se, even though he calls it in the same way, to make you understand really, of course, the constant compenetration of the political element that very often in Reconstruction is taken away altogether, because, as if war was, in reality, a kind of concept suspensed outside the realm of reality, when you can say, if I pick one soldier that is equipped like this and another that is equipped like that, and they're equal in abilities, what the fuck that does even mean? Who's gonna win, right? This kind of ideas, right? This is this, standard pack 1.0, mental deficiency, but don't think that more complex things in this sense, are handled with more care, and actually the degree of, of imbecility increases the more you go on, so the one of idiocy in parallel at the same time. And we are relatively well informed, telling the truth, about the apprenticeship of martial arts, at least from an individual point of view, in the sense that there were different channels through which someone could get a military training in the past. Just as today, frankly. And we are, again, documented about that. We'll make a video about that, so I will leave you without it for today. But focusing on the one of collective training, it basically, again, is always what makes the difference, what the broader, what helps you just in the hierarchy of, of importance. What helps you, it's the first step that helps you connect into the higher level, right? To the strategy, to the politics of the military employment. And that is effectively the one that wins, that makes battle won, right? When you reconstruct a medieval battle like any other, you realize that none of the sources that even knew about the battles and know that the bullshit that the Middle Ages, is described just by priests that have never seen a battlefield is just means that you don't have any idea what medieval historiography is about. But it's always focusing on not on what kind of weapon those guys had or what they hadn't, whatever. It was always about essentially the cooperation, the synergy of battle lines, right? That line arrived before in that place, it remained cut out from the rest of the mass, so it was overrun, and then the other arrived. It's all about that. I never tell you, it's that individual guy will do the thing, unless it's in a position of command, which is perfectly congruent with the Clausewitzian theory, and that insists on the moment of decision. And we will see how, in fact, late medieval sources, at least when we start getting something more manualistic in intention rather than in form, rather prescription, let's say, in some consistencies, always stresses, of course, that aspect, which is actually part of what I've always thought, that is to say, and that I think it's self-evident if you're just acquainted to historiography, that throughout all the history of warfare, the Clausewitzian principles that are not von Clausewitz are again what war is, right, in general, in universal terms, are there and are obviously there because people making war knew what it was about, how it was fought, what it felt like to be in it, what was the thing properly working like, what is that made the difference, and in more or less in which measure, right, given that it's still an unintelligible, positivistically unintelligible system, but still, the idea of command and morale is essentially the first aspect that these sources stress with an incredible accuracy, meaning that whenever you are fooled by contemporary historiography, the new I don't know even how to call it, new military history or whatever that is, which new military history basically means, we discovered that we are dumb fucks and that we didn't understand anything about the history of war because we had never studied it, and maybe, studying it again, even though we don't know how to study it, will make something. But that's what the new military history has been, historiographically speaking, and that's why, it's just basically a pile of garbage in truly academic scientific terms. For all, of course, the culturalist plague that has infected it, and the complete lack of any form properly of strategic education in Clausewitzian culture, for that matter. But I don't even know how we got there. But the point is that, we have an idea again that this was a heavily militarized society, medieval one, that there was an evident attitude to war just from the start of your life. You could argue, especially in those moments where, in fact, the individual training was particularly high for reasons that had to do with the narrower scale of collective training, if you want. That is something essentially that you have to consider even under the light of the different degree of documentation, because probably a 6th century chieftain would have told you something way more insightful probably than a 15th century man-at-arms regarding properly the mindset and the universal worldview and what warfare meant within it, right? We are unfortunately the children of the Enlightenment, and so rather than looking for that pretty eloquent message, again, that the sources, that's what they're saying, that stress overwhelmingly from a moral point of view. Like, they don't even care to tell you about the formation, not even about the tactics per se, but, who was scared, who feared, who was more courageous, who were more impetuous, who and they tell it in ways that are extremely subtle from a strictly literary, linguistic point of view, that are beautiful, that render the complexity, the depth, the moral depth of a battle in a much better way than if you had actually, even just as a contemporary, would have probably even seen the battle per se, right? Because what they were feeling, it was much closer at the time to what was actually felt by those people who were on that battlefield, not as an average person, but as that person in those times, which you are not, and you cannot ever afford to be. And that's, of course, what we simply betrayed, because we said, who the hell cares about other people in the past? We are the better ones because we're more intelligent and more, even though we don't know shit, even though we don't make any effort anymore, even though we're just a bunch of undereducated animals that do not do anything all the day long. But, we are better, right? Because we have TV. And so these people in the past were just like a bunch of children slash savages, without any idea or think that they had to teach us. And there is just a strictly materialistic, deterministic, relativistic interpretation that we must start from, just the technical side of the story. And who cares about the judgment of these people? Because after all, we know better, than them, of course, how it was in their time compared to ours, except we don't understand a fuck about what is happening even today. If you ask the average person, they think, they live in, I don't know where. But, that doesn't matter, right? We are better, and so everything is good. So the point of collective training is that it doesn't seem to be from the sources any hint of any regular organization of collective training, right? Of either small or big maneuvers. While this is true in the sense that if you really study thoroughly a specific time in history, you don't really encounter that explicit prescription or issue or whatever that asks for this. You maybe have lots of prescriptional documents like how troops should be equipped, right? And that opens also to a lot of interesting unfortunate speculations, because there we often in fact lack the source and the type of source that doesn't exist seemingly, about also how these people kept these weapons, who provided them with them. That we should digress on that on other videos, because that's really like a big question mark. If you want to answer just with with evidence in any form, you will not find any of that. Or even maybe we haven't searched well in the archives, but at this point, right, it seems, if there's had been a major historiographical evidence, we would have already found it, stumbled in it. This, however, in turn doesn't mean actually that the collective training did not exist, which is kind of pretty obvious, because collective training has always existed since the dawn of warfare. And it's obviously confirmed by the fact that in battle descriptions, over and over again, from basically all the sources, we are told, of course, of the exceptional capacities, very often exactly because they didn't have anything like a fully, statalized, centralized training or anything. The maneuvers, right? The battle performance of the various units. And this is an enormously interesting thing. I'm writing something just about this currently. That is to say, if you look at what these, for example, infantry units, right, that are somewhat the more difficult to train collectively because they cost more after all, right? It's not just properly a relative problem, because knights, as we will see, were trained since childhood, or boyhood at least, to war, and they had all the resources, and so it was kind of easy for them to habituate themselves to a sort of, just practice of warfare without any much talk, but just, going there among the others that were continuously perpetuating this military tradition, and we will explain it now. When you look at commoners and you realize that they were pretty, fighting in pretty compact units, assigning the knightly ones, carrying out also complex maneuvers, circling around, coming back, maintaining cohesion, even taking on cavalry at some point, you realize that these people had been trained in a way or another. Even about that, we don't find much information. In the case of commoners, that infantry is a bit neglected also by historiography altogether, because when the feudal elite dominated, it dominated in a way that is not directly proportional from a cultural to a military point of view, which means that those who wrote mostly were just, from the feudal milieu. This is true, not always. And that were essentially the only people who would concern themselves with that kind of, ideology making, whereas the commoners, by a certain degree, didn't give a damn, or also were framed within that kind of ideology. And so we still see, of course, that, say, by the 13th century, that was the peak of feudal warfare, there was a lot of infantry on the battlefields. It's just that, feudal historiography tends to obscure them, because to them they were not important. It doesn't mean that they weren't actually important for a tactical point of view, also because they were always there, so that surely meant something. And believe me, if you check, even the most competent scholars about these topics, you realize that nobody has really aggressed this topic with the proper passion, with the proper hunger of knowledge, because it's so vague in a sense, and it requires, a very intense, properly art of warfare specialty, studying diachronically and comparatively various battles, various cultures, various countries, etc., that they prefer just to sectorialize further in ways that basically distract you from the broader picture that instead, again, the art of war would actually require. Now, the counter, not really counter argument, but let's say the other side of this is, of course, that in the Middle Ages, having large bodies of intensely trained men was rare, right, in the first place. Was not rare, perhaps, depends on what you mean by large, of course. We see that before the mid-15th century, having formations of, thousands of pikemen intensely drilled to have also giving an aggressive, independent capacity of infantry capable of defeating cavalry wasn't really there, right? Some systems had approximated to that in medieval times. There are lots of ups and downs, basically, in the art of war itself. The crisis of the 14th century is much more impacting on these issues than it's often been regarded, also because of all the bullshit of the military revolution and the utter delusion that people towards the end of the Middle Ages actually gained more freedom or independence, and that the individual became more important. That's just in the abstract cloud world of the humanists that also start writing history in a factually, in fact, soulless way, right? Compared to what the municipal chronicler, just the century before would have done it, that would see warfare with his eyes, right? Whereas those guys instead were just kept within the courts, making a luxurious life and digging about the history of the Greeks and the Romans, but not really seeing battlefields of their own time anymore, and so factually not understanding much, nor about the former nor about the latter. Of course, other things developed in the Renaissance, so shouldn't be so negative. But about this, don't think that we are still not influenced by also lots of mistakes that have been done historiographically to interpret medieval battles from, say, a Renaissance perspective, with some claims or with some adaptation in the same narratives of the battle logic and everything like that. And the reason why there were, however, few formations of large amount of trained men altogether, which I'm specifically referring to the technical functionality of a unit, right? I'm not talking about the fact that, of course, the Middle Ages witnessed pretty large amounts of troops, like armies of 30,000 men were there. Like they had been in antiquity as, kind of the maximum type of properly a collective unit that was, however, made up of various contingents that came from different places, from different backgrounds, and that actually, so perhaps just in these battles that happen every once in a while, to say the least, but they were not so infrequent as they've been told you. In the Middle Ages, pitched battles were rare. No, frankly, I don't think that there is any evidence that is true compared to, say, the ancient world, or not even the modern world, because also parameters change in a way that we can't really say that. And pitched battles in medieval times were actually more frequent than you imagine. It also, again, depends on which country and which time, because it's true that resources were limited. This was the main problem, right? But It's not that medieval warfare was necessarily more dominated by, say, siege warfare than the ancient world. The ancient world tells, for example, history in a different way. We know dramatically less, right? And whenever we know a little bit more about the details, we don't have reasons to think that, I don't know, siege warfare was not important, the raids were not important. Actually, they were pretty much the same thing, right? Because what's the difference between ancient and medieval? Nobody actually knows. It's a pure invention and convention. In any case, this single specific unit didn't find a broader collective training, and they wouldn't objectively up to very late in time, right? We have to wait fundamentally the France of Louis XIV to have like an entire national army that, albeit still, yes, being based on units that were kind of trained in sometimes in different ways, different etc. That didn't have necessarily the full preparation, right, or the standard preparation for fighting in any single context in the same way, but starts being trained properly in an ever more intensively homogeneous and large army-sized form of training. And we'll see it partly today, because military academies basically start existing only since the Renaissance, because at that point states were becoming larger, and therefore they needed a much greater level of organization, and standardization facilitated greatly things, but it also required a lot of money that normally the quite fragmented political fragmented situation in medieval times couldn't make you afford. But still providing with a dramatic effort actually from an individual point of view. It's been calculated, I don't know if it gets contaminated, saying that in the 14th century, I don't know, medieval France or whatever it was, I think original medieval France provided normally with a larger amount of people that were habitually for a reason or another involved in warfare, right, for the same employment than, say, the Prussia of Frederick II in the 18th century. That is the peak of militarism, right? People were much more habituated to violence, to killing, to massacres, to traumas. They were dramatically more morally powerful individuals than we are today. It's just they lacked that functional, the actual possibilities, not the intelligence, but the possibilities of putting together armies of larger size and maintaining them for combat in that way, so that they compensated with that kind of more individual force. Except, of course, whenever they had the possibility of fielding larger armies, they invested immediately resources in that, and because they knew that, of course, they were superior even to individual moral power, right? It's obvious that, it's not even technology, you see, it's just, in fact, collective training. It's not that a Swiss pikeman of the mid-15th century, as a military professional, in terms of individual combat, was anything significant in front of, let's say, his ancestor, an Alemannic 6th century warrior, right? The first one, the latter would have, butchered him down without even thinking. It's just that the collective thing made the overwhelming superiority that of, the Swiss square pikes would have wiped the hell out of any 6th century infantry formation. So this is kind of like the ABC of the art of war. If you still haven't understood these things in perspective by scale, well, that's where you should start fixing things pretty fast. But in this sense, we shouldn't be surprised in general that the Middle Ages, and not only, haven't provided us with the actual drills, trainings, also because during modern age it's a bit the same thing. We've made videos about Maurice of Nassau, Gustavus Adolphus. Those are also instances in which the Protestant historiography wanted to glorify the political and military success of these leaders because they were Protestant, and essentially inventing that these people had standardized drill, or they had invented new things that nobody had come up with. They were just fighting basically how any other fought. It's just they intensified some degree of homogeneity and uniformity because they made more war than the others because of certain specific political, military, and social dynamics. And so armies reflected that in an extremely gradual, almost imperceptible, and in fact in some cases not even demonstrable way. Like, some innovations attributed to them wouldn't kick in even in their respective national armies in generations. So it's a bit always the same positivistic bias that we have, like, Marius invented the Courtal Legion. No, it was already there, right? It didn't change anything in a strictly military sense. It was just a political reform. And that's, again, why we don't understand von Clausewitz. We still pretend that we can learn history as we please. And even the first evidence of there is some evidence in terms of, say, paramilitary activities that armies, let's say, that those who would eventually participate to armies underwent. For example, it's typical, speaking of the commoners and militias, to see, since ancient times, all throughout the Middle Ages, this kind of festivals where people made acrobacies, or there were some faction sides, they played some game, they beat at each other, they actually often killed each other, they threw stones at each other, and everybody got in, kids, and there was that same kind of segmentation you find in the older war bands, where there is, the grizzled veteran that is the kind of hairier guy, more affluent dude, has better equipment and training and experience, and then the kid that has to learn and makes the lightest roles that are kind of riskier, but because he has less, but he has to prove the others that he's aging and into manhood and all these kind of things. And gradually this is just paramilitary stuff, right? So this is what would make just the average militia, that is an unprofessional stuff, etc., but still would hold the ground for a while, right? If you have been stabbing people to death during brawls, if you stone them, things like that, if you've seen blood, you torture, you kind of get used to what a battlefield can be like, right? After all, warfare is nothing specifically but violence, right? In the metaphysical concept of Clausewitzian theory, war is just an act of violence, right? The fact that is, where does war begin and, brawl start? There is no difference. It doesn't even make sense anthropologically to ask for this, right? There are some standards that we want to trace, kind of a more settled sense, a more centralized sense, which in fact collective training has an important goal. But, we are social animals, so basically, that is kind of intrinsic, in our behavior, in our group dynamics, in hunting, and all these things. And in fact, there could be a very interesting video we could make. When did war actually start? Because we start intending it as such. But it's something just natural, right? It happens, right? And those were times in which the state didn't quite exist. There was some public authority, but de facto the world was ruled by mafia. And the mafia was made up by these people, right? Effectively, what is the difference between hush money and a tribute, right? What's a chieftain in the migration era doing? It's basically the same thing. It's a mobster. And with the same exact type of anthropological kind of, attitude, behavior, mentality, practices, rituals, etc. So it's basically the same thing. And you can document it easily also in the areas in the world where, the state is weaker and therefore criminality is stronger. And you see exactly the same thing. It's a mini-state that the mob rules. And in this, of course, the less the authority and the more the violence, practically, right? And the history of the world is basically about this, right? Our omnipowerful states at this were never omnipowerful because they required the decisive moral superiority of the population to rule in the first place. Are kind of very recent anyway, the degree of power that our state of centralization that it has, and equally also our degree of the habituation to violence, right? Which is another issue, right? That people say, but war is not made less. Perhaps it's just a coincidence of what happened in the world politically, the balance. Well, yes. But as individuals, there is absolutely no doubt that just compared even to 100 years ago, we're completely habituated to violence. Like 100 years ago, people were, if you said, will you go die for your fatherland and will you get killed in a trench, exploding, killing other people? Oh, yeah, sure. Everybody does it. What's strange with that? Ask a person today, the average person, and they get hysterical reactions because they don't even understand what war is, that it exists, what politics is practically. And so this brings to enormous disasters, including more wars for that matter. Just look at properly at the incapacity, in some world militaries today, the incapacity properly of understanding what war is and knowing how to fight one. So this is an incredibly serious cultural problem. It is the same one that I was talking about before. These people want to reconstruct warfare. They don't even know what warfare is practically, but they just want to flatter themselves in thinking that they kind of know. In any case, it's a much more complex thing, even for those who study it, and and even for those who fight it, than it seems, right? And it takes an enormous, again, amount of work to actually to master even the same knowledge of warfare. Big von Clausewitz was not just a random military historian, but not just a random general of the Napoleonic Wars. So it's obvious that whenever we start seeing some collective training issued in a more functional sense, and not always in the way Sergov, in my opinion, has in fact used the right criterion to spot, is the Middle Ages is something pretty mild in the form of game, rather than in this sense, in fact, is considered more than just the average form of paramilitary training, because it's issued in the context of what was starting to be in part a professional army. That is in the Ordonnance of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. We made videos about the Burgundian army, and we will keep making them, so you can check that, as I made a specific one about the battle formations that weren't even used in actual warfare. That's the interesting thing, that the command of Charles the Bold and the Duke himself played a game, right? This is also another important aspect of warfare that entails the gambling, this kind of, let's try this and see what happens. But we know that, they drew down these sketches, these predispositions for the army, but eventually battles were fought, we know, with different formations. So that's also, like in treatises, etc., not really what warfare was about. But we look truly at these very late medieval sources, finding in them some hint relative to collective training. For example, in the occasion of the French-English meeting of Tours that would bring to the truce of 1444, in the 100 Years' War, there was a archery competition between the soldiers of the Earl of Suffolk and the archers of the Scottish Guard of Charles VII. So there are a bit of British rivalry there. That the latter which won the prize that had been predisposed. And this is quite interesting because you understand that it's just a game, right? It's a form of marksmanship. I doubt that it was any truly collective test there, because archers in battle, by the way, relied on volleys and not on precision firing in order to be effective, really. So the collective value of these troops surely had to do in part with how individually skilled they were as marksmen, but that had actually very few to do, in fact, with the real collective dimension of warfare. In any case, this was a way of still, competing, like in this case during a truce, where instead of killing each other, would at least still compete against one another in a bloodless way. And of course, the question of how maneuvering on the battlefield without apparent training, such a compact body of around 10,000 men, like the one made up by the Swiss at Grandson or Morat and Nancy and elsewhere, just talking about the most important battles of the Swiss-Burgundian War, is kind of nonsensical in part, right? It's pretty obvious that the Swiss, that are famous exactly for this, dramatically trained their own troops starting from the mid 15th century, right, or the last decades of the first half of the 15th century, and that's what made Swiss infantry essentially that thing that for half a century fundamentally dominated Western European battlefields, at least as mercenary infantry, against sometimes properly the cavalry elite. We made videos about the Swiss here and there. I will talk about them more. I will not digress again on how Swiss warfare was radically different between the 14th and the 15th century respectively, and the latter system in fact emerged from the famously, but I shouldn't even repeat this. This is kind of anybody knows anything about medieval warfare just knows these things by heart. By the increase of pikemen in the array, right, over the halberdiers that fundamentally became the minority, that could occur only by providing pikemen with a much greater training, given that the pike requires, in order to be effective, a large amount of men, and thus also a large amount of training, because they are a large formation, and the pike swings dangerously, and it has to be held in place. It doesn't even, as you know, the defense was ridiculous when pikemen arrived against their enemy. It was not even important. They were just piercing blindly, even at some point, just in a very brutal and even primitive way, because and that's what we were saying about before in terms of individual capacity, because the whole point of the thing was having this formation having the unprecedented speed that a mass of infantrymen had never had, again, the training in order not to lose properly compactness of the formation in the process, to outtime the enemies on the battlefield, to catch them by surprise, and not giving them properly even the possibility of reacting tactically speaking, which is factually what happened against the Burgundian army. That was instead much more sophisticated from a military point of view, much more complete from a tactical point of view, and that probably in this sense didn't even have anything particularly wrong, and was not even particularly different from like the other armies of the time. Also, military contexts are very often mythologized in a sense. Those who win have to have the magic trick specialty, and they had to win, right? It's a deterministic thing, whereas everybody knows that in warfare nobody can really predict anything more than, especially more than in any other human activity in terms properly of outcome and what is at stake with that. But that was it, right? Maintaining cohesion, advance. Other infantry units had the same capacity, basically all of them, right? All infantry units during the Middle Ages could move, could advance, right? The point is that what did they look like when they actually came to grips with the enemy, and especially when they had to meet cavalry? That's a completely different story. It's just like the pike. The pike exists since prehistoric times. The pike was there throughout all medieval armies, all the single times. And yet, again, it's not technology. What was about their lacking was the political and social compaction necessary to provide with the surplus necessary to train this man to become so specifically drilled to maintain formation in that circumstance, right? And much of this has naturally to do with moral forces as well, because you can't be particularly developed also in that way if you're not confident about your situation, if you don't really want something to happen, if you want, like the early Swiss that gained their own independence with ridiculous tactics, with some of the most primitive, absolutely unrefined, unsophisticated ones that nobody would have envied per se, but it was about they wanted to rip the guts out of the people that were in front of them. And that's basically the only thing that matters when you go at war. It tends to make the difference overall, and not just in combat, but throughout the whole campaign, so that you can even win a war by losing every single battle, right? That's what moral forces actually mean. And so it's not a technical thing, it's not the special, it was about, yes, in this sense, inventing a tactics that was also a huge gamble, because before developing it and enacting it. It's not that people say, Swiss sat in their valleys and cantons, we have found a way to beat them. We are sure that we're going to win. No. They were shitting in their own pants while advancing without any cavalry support against the whole enemy army and hoping that it would, be an effective maneuver, because otherwise they would have been all butchered down like animals, like it was the normality at the time. So just thinking being that phalanx and wondering this, if you don't have, in your head and heart something that makes you being there for a reason. So of course these troops were intensely drilled and trained, right? And there was something about the background of this man that was still kind of normally oriented like that, in embryo, right? In an unprofessional way, in a paramilitary way, but that was eventually functionalized, right? People say that the original Swiss phalanx, the one also of the 14th century victories, was just, the normal spear wall of the migration era Zippe. And objectively, in these corners of Europe, yes, not many things had changed from those time onwards, right? And what had made the difference in that specific moment was just the revived moral and material force that these communities had began to acquire for different reasons, and why before in the same places also the feudal aristocracy on horseback had dominated, in fact, morally and materially over the same people. So you understand that you cannot explain any of this in a progressistic, technologistic fashion, and that most of the, again, military revolution, new military history approach is really not a very interesting one to tell it all. Consider in all this, and this is a more of a theoretical aspect of the whole, but we've seen it very often, especially talking about military theory with von Clausewitz, but also Montecuccoli, Machiavelli, etc. The Middle Ages ignored the staff officers' schools, right? Military academies. These institutions appear in Italy in the 16th century for the first time. In France, the first institution can be compared to a military school. It's probably the Académie des Exercices, created by Henri de la Tour d'Auvergne, the Duke of Bouillon, in 1607. Why? Because up to that point, warfare had simply introduced you to itself without any theoretical background needed, or also this theoretical background was surely provided in some form, orally, right? Just this is the standard thing of a medieval knight. Your father is a knight. You are meant to be a knight, and if that's your path specifically, you're being told about warfare all the freaking time. It means you're brainwashed. You don't learn about anything else, because objectively that's the entire purpose for which your family exists, and it's the elite and it's dominating. Everything is settled like that. Everything is, of course, politically settled, but given, as we were saying before, the political fragmentation, general disorder, warfare is just normal. Right, you are basically to be risen as a killer that doesn't have to maintain human life in any form of consideration, and it has to be able to butcher down people without blinking an eye. That's the only thing that you have to become, because and that's actually what you really want and need your military to be about, because that's the only purpose that the military has, and we should thank God for having that, because if we didn't have that, as it often happens, we would be taken over by the next son of bitch next door, but maybe also a savage, and but very often it's the other way around, given that it's actual civilizations that kick ass for that matter. And guess why? Because they're more intelligent and advanced, and you will be sent to, you will be essentially traumatized to be sent to be essentially taken away from your family, from your household, from your mother, from your siblings that you will probably never see again, and sent in the house of another lord with other boys that are basically a bunch of abusers, ambitious motherfuckers, as essentially you have to become in the same way. You will be destroyed as a human being and rebuilt as a killing machine through a radical amount of the most traumatically possible psychophysical abuse that you can imagine, and you will start simply together with these people going at war, right? You will simply, will not know what to do in the battle line in the first place. You will first be a squire, and you will follow the other knights and see how they fight, and then once you have learned that, you will start being part of them, etc., etc. You will start killing people, and you will essentially learn how to lead the ranks at some point, to make sensible tactical and eventually strategical decision, and hopefully you will rise to the ranks if you don't get killed in some way, if you don't get sick, etc. And you will hopefully become a lord on your own, with your own retinue, knowing where to go, what to do, and probably you will die young and in the most horrifying ways, but still, that's a living. And you will have increased maybe in some relevant way your household, that you will have built in the meanwhile, maintaining connection with the old one and with the ones who have been nurtured, right? You will again have massacred a wide amount of people. You were broken into tears every time, in the bivouac, at night in the fire, somebody sang the stories of princesses and dames that reminded you of your mother and sisters that have died giving birth, and you will be the single most interesting things for psychiatrists 1,000 years later to speculate on. But let's say, again, that's, what was the point of somebody teaching you warfare? Like, you knew how to do it already. It was not really another way of doing it, right? At some point, what is interesting there is that you would have also brutalized an important amount of people, peasantry, commoners, etc., to form at some point some battle for, say, units to follow your cavalry, etc., and you will have used a pretty ferocious discipline to affirm that, and so you would have been the one actually training somebody else, and you would have done the same with the men in your retinues, the new boys coming in, etc., right? So in this situation, who did actually need to be trained? This is kind of the description of a 13th century knight, right? But you can argue that by the 15th century, armies were something more complex. But telling the truth, yeah, they were. They were also, and especially from a technical point of view, meaning that these armies, it's not that they were necessarily much larger, it's that they were much bulkier, right, and heavier and more expansive, right? And so there was something also about the interaction of the various arms that was becoming kind of more evidently functional, etc. So that's why these academies are born in the Renaissance eventually, because people realized that it was important to explain certain things theoretically that could be useful to give an insight and an idea of what warfare was to the younger people. But it's not that these younger people yet at the time were not habituated to violence or didn't know actually how to simply to go to war. Because let's be honest about this. What you need to learn in terms of literally the basics of how an army works and how to to order the lines, etc. It's something that you can learn in a relatively quick time, right? For a person today, just even entering the mindset, it's something extremely complicated, but at the time, it was kind of self-evident, right? As always, the warfare is actually simpler than it seems, right? It's just very difficult, right? And understanding its difficulty is the hardest thing among the others from a theoretical point of view, and you have to understand why the system happens. Once it happens, it's relatively simple, right? Armies are not hyper complicated, articulated, etc. It's complicated to feed them, to make sensible strategic choices to the end of supplying them, to negotiate their employment politically, whatever. That's really the messed up thing. But let's say how to order an army to form up a battle line. How to drill, how to check, even the various individuals. It's something that you have to practically learn how to do, but conceptually, it's rather simple, right? Again, it's difficult to do, but it's easy altogether. It's not particularly complex in the thing. So everybody would know that. Everybody would know that again, 100 years ago, everybody would know how to milk a cow or how to build a house, right? You just did it. Everybody knew that, right? Just today, nobody has the palest idea of what that even means or how to do it. Even if it's objectively not even that difficult either, but to understand. But it's that barrier that we're completely that separates us from the reality, and it's a barrier that we created ourselves, right? So it's pretty obvious that in the Middle Ages at large, military apprenticeship was in war, in the battlefield, right? Hence, the necessity to begin very early, when you were still adolescent, to accumulate the experience over the years. Which is kind of obvious, right? Human beings, telling the truth, like at 14 are adults, right? People age much faster at the time. And they develop properly also certain feeling of camaraderie. We'll talk about it now with the Jouvencel, that even as a military treatise title is quite meaningful, and it's something you can't really understand in terms of friendship. Even if you today, if you just go to school, what kind of feeling there is about those years, about your schoolmates, the group, those kind of dynamics. Well, imagine this in a situation where you actually even fantasize about bullying is a part of that kind of, of that abuse, of that form of, toughening you up. Just imagine having to do it, just going to kill people, as was the norm at that age. So for you to be properly a military individual, but even if you were like a commoner, right, you were probably habituated to cattle raiding, to some form of crime at the level. Yeah, it was, we would have seen a bunch of killed people in your time before your adulthood, and maybe you would have been also the author of that killing. So it's not really a big deal, honestly. It's just that in order to lead, well, that's something entirely different, right? And that's what, in fact, the knights, that were really the elite that control the whole thing, would understand better. Of course, not all knights, but someone who was starting also to be educated, know how to write, how to engage, which was actually not even such a strange thing, right? Not maybe in terms of literacy, because most warriors in the Middle Ages were actually literate, as you know, and the majority were still by the end of the Middle Ages. But in terms of other activities like even poetry, singing, right, it was part of that actually masculine model, right? As I often say, it was very, very well known, is that the peak of male creativity is the peak of male violence, male crime, especially. So, which means violence, actually, translated in non-secular, non-modern terms. Because it's kind of obvious. Like, that as a male, you get exalted easily. When you achieve results, you want to do more, and you feel adrenaline, and you have to vent it, and you want women, and you want to kill the bastards, and everything, right? It sounds crazy, because we've been kind of repressed dramatically in our culture, but it's actually what we're made of, right? And a great part of this is, of course, this is all the natural instinctive process that more like the you would immediately get. But warfare teaches you, especially the more complex warfare is, discipline, authority, self-control, which are by far the single most difficult thing that you have to learn if you want not just to command, which requires gigantic moral forces of any kind. Any person in position of command is basically suffering by far more than the person disemboweled in the front, on the front line, because it has the entire responsibility of the whole freaking system at home on the battlefield on him. And that's why these people had to be brutal, right? And that's why they had to be completely desensitized, because it's not that they didn't have to understand what, as we'll see now, what camaraderie was, what the value of life, of life of properly of your own men was. It's just that you wouldn't have to have any, in terms of the logic, the rationale that warfare obliged you, sending people to die and killing others at the same time. And so the authors of this later sources that we start finding at the end of the Middle Ages often insist on the prodromes, right, on the slow maturation, on the necessary graduality in the assumption, in taking on the responsibilities, right? And that's again very well expressed by the older, by the traditional cultures, right? It's just that there is all the segmentation. We talk about the Germanic comitatus, what we were saying before about the boys, the leaders. We've seen even think about the manipular Roman army, the young people in the front, and then the richer, grizzled veterans in the rear, because it was all the same system, right? It starts from there and it develops into something more civilized, more advanced, more destructive, more effective. But it begins with those core dynamics for which humanity is programmed biologically. There is an extremely interesting source, also a very famous one, that is the aforementioned Le Jovencel by Jean de Bouille. That was a commander, was a man at arms in the 100 Years' War, a French author of this treatise that is fundamentally based on this idea of military development. And it's divided in 3 parts that have been defined in different ways, but that I want to see under the light of the Clausewitzian Trinity. Because the first part of the work talks about the government of a single man, the second of the government of yourself and the others, and the third of the government of the princes and of the captains that have at heart the government of the country and of the people, which in my opinion can have to do with the social dimension, which is actually the individual one, right? In Clausewitzian terms, the instinctive, the primitive, the hatred, right? This kind of ancient, older, more natural, animal-like dimension. So when you look at about the government of a single man, it has to do with this. The second part is the military, right? It's the second element of the Trinity. So the government of yourself and of the others, so how to command the others, right? And what you have to do yourself in order to command them. And then the third is basically politics, right? And so understanding, as always, how war is just a political instrument and a continuation of politics with other means. And in my opinion, Le Jovencel acknowledges this, like other traditional mindsets and systems, etc. I made a video last autumn about Caesar's religion, the Fortuna, that is basically soaked into, that's archaic Roman religion, but fundamentally soaked into, that's Clausewitzian theory. It perfectly overlaps. It's the same perfect thing. So all peoples, cultures in the world, simply by fighting, knew what this thing fundamentally was about. All their religions, and essentially the entirety of their worldview was dominated by struggle and victory in the form of a political, military, and social activity, as we also have discussed in other videos, really. And there is an interesting text of the 12th century which talks about the necessity to learn the art of war since from youth. That says something like this in Latin, that is homo bellicosus ab infantia in armis nutritus, which means warlike man nourished in arms from childhood, right? Which is beautiful, because the 12th century, it's more or less what we were saying about before, is the standard type of brutal, normal horizon, what like a young aristocrat would have gone to fight, like not just an aristocrat. Depends really again in the areas of Europe which we're talking about, because the younger the better, right? When you're younger, you learn much more easily, much more quickly. That's the reason why we send children to school still today, because they're like sponges, right? Whatever, that's crucial, right, for a civilization. today we don't give a fuck about education, right? We send children to school like a sort of, um, recreation time for socializing, right? That has to do with, that's important, don't get me wrong, but still we should educate them to be intelligent people. And the results, I think, in adulthood are readily evident to everyone. We don't give a damn about that. Nobody cares about that because there is no driving force, there is no pressure. In times like the Middle Ages, objectively learning about different things like today was, they are mostly theoretically oriented because our world today does need theory over practice more because it's so complex that we need to hurry up even, but without forgetting practice even. At the time, it was, you want to survive, okay, you have to become a killer yourself. So the quicker you learn, the better you fit that role, right? And I would like to point out that the Middle Ages created modernity in the process from practically unknown state, from tribes, right? So, of course, there were important prodromes of civilization in the ancient world, and those helped like hell. But I mean, this was a time which things worked, which medieval civilization made it into a superior form. And they made it through this mechanism, which was pretty much universal and uncontested. Like, there is not a phrase here that says, a source here that says, well, no, you see, you shouldn't really send adolescents to fight because it's bad. And it was obvious, like, nobody would contest that. Like somebody would say, these wars are bad, God is punishing us, we shouldn't, our leaders should know better. A bit like today, because politics was about this, but nobody said, like, okay, we shouldn't have armies, we shouldn't send people to be trained in the way they do, or no, because let's say, how would you even become, the armed branch of justice? Let's say, how can you create a state? How can you govern a land without actually punishing the unruly? Right? How do you create a state if you don't kill those mobsters? And that's exactly what the Middle Ages, well, okay, not entirely because this contemporary state comes later, but the important step of creating something more robust and steadily oriented was achieved very successfully in medieval times. So for those time standards, for possibilities, etc. So this aspect must be absolutely recognized today too. You cannot have a functional civilization if you don't boost moral force, if you make people scared of everything, if you bring them down superstitiously by telling them they're too weak and they're done for just because they're born with a certain skin color, or because whatever their sex is, because let's be honest, gender does not exist. Nor does all the other bullshit that they want to feed you with, that, the world is ending, right? They thought the world was ending at the time as well, because objectively they lived in a world where things were really pretty messed up, right? And today we're just like slobs that, for every single minimal dissonance, freak out, go in panic, intox themselves with pills because they can't stand the threat of reality. Oh my God, learn what people did in medieval times. Then watch yourself in the mirror and spit yourself in the face. Do yourself this favor. Therefore, war as the place of experience, of science, of reason, and of discretion. These are all common topoi of medieval literature, and they are all pretty damn right? Morally, scientifically, basically everything we know about humanity psychologically today comforts every single one of those views. It's not a personal opinion. It should be discussed, but not in the sense that this is something you can divert from. Right? This is just something that it's not told out loud, but that science actually says pretty clearly whenever you put the various, data of the various subjects, the various branches together. There's not a single one that doesn't actually fit with this picture. And this is, again, something that a couple of centuries ago was pretty clear, still, pretty much to everyone in practice. And just today we are so detached from, in a sense, fortunately, because we have achieved something better from one side, but we have not cared about the other, right? So don't despise modernity just per se. Just realize how it failed, because it had much more than before and didn't know how, and simply, forgot. It simply lost the moral effort necessary to handle it. Right? It's that simple, after all. So this medieval literature is actually right about it. We can follow the same Jean de Bouille of the Le Jovencel, who declares that, quote, the most important aspect of war is, after God, bear in mind, the discretion of the leader. Right? This is important not just because in all medieval battle accounts, or at least those who mention that, not always, by the way, and not even so often as you would think, God, of course, decides who wins and who loses. And you would think, this is a superstitious idea, damn Christianity, blah, blah, blah. But actually the obvious meaning is that if you don't understand the world, right, and if you fail to research the truth in objective and universal terms, that is, God, you cannot obtain in anything, right? You cannot even hope to accept what is going to happen, because it doesn't matter how much you know. Of course, it's not even remotely close to the wall, to the truth, right? So you have always, even just as a military man, to accept risk statistically, so there is no way out. But after that, and as God, so as a leader, as a lord, the discretion of the commander, right, which is crucial. Von Clausewitz insists dramatically on this when, in front of the fog of war, in front of the pressure of your subordinates that lose hope and heart, of all the wrong information that comes at you not losing control, maintaining calm and reasoning lucidly, and managing to take important decisions in that mess really brings light in the darkness, right? And so the similarity with God is crucial, right? This aspect is basically the whole motivating purpose of mankind, making sense out of chaos, right? And this is based on by taking decisions. If you don't take risk, you cannot achieve anything. And in order to do that, you have to decide. You have to use determination, to use what you know rationally, but to take the step in order to make what you know will fix the situation. And that requires heart, requires courage, right? And the two things alone are not enough. They must be combined. And war prepares you and, properly habituates you to that, makes you more effective at it. It's terrifying, but until you experience it, you can't fully understand that. Jean de Bouille also attributes to the famous French military commander of the 100 Years' War, La Hire, Etienne de Vignon, he was Charles VII bodyguard. He had fought an enormous amount of battle, mostly victoriously, but also in bloody defeats. He came out alive. He was covered in scars. He died probably, consequence of all the wounds he had accumulated, participated to the siege of Orléans. He had really seen it all before, right? One of those most complete knights of his time. Well, he was defined by Jean de Bouille as the good doctor in military science. Jean also underlines that the conduct of war is sophisticated and subtle, for which it's important to be dominate in order to dominate it as an art and science, to proceed with little steps before having a perfect knowledge of that. It's naturally idealistic, but it gets to the point that there is a, step-by-step advancement in something really big, right? That you cannot master if you do not properly own part by part to the point of really managing it all, right? Which again is a pretty very common. You cannot have what you cannot control, right? And this is the harshest part, right, of human limits in general, right? It's harsher, arguably, than the entire brutality of war per se, but this is the greatest test, in fact, right? Managing to retain control in this situation. There are beautiful psychological passages of Le Jovencel, including some on camaraderie, right? Speaking of the love of your for your comrade in battle, to the point of saying, you can really love that moment when you want to. It's beautiful to see your comrade fighting next to you, and you will not have any fear at that point of protecting him, even when the situation is extremely risky, because you will have reached that kind of status in which you go beyond, and you, by having participated in war, having relied on these fellow armed men in combat already, in campaign, and throughout all this terrifying time, you will have established a bond that is what makes the spirit of the unit. It is the esprit de corps, and that is not just, okay, I just attach this unit. No, it's functional to combat itself. It really will make you exposed to any kind of danger in order to save your own companion, and the death of which is traumatic. We know it just very famously in all the, in all the history of warfare. The most famous example, think about Achilles with Patroclus, all the, let's say, the mythology, the spirituality, the metaphysical kind of vision of what war is, not just for war, but for the purpose of man. Naturally, there's a lot attached, in fact, to post-traumatic stress disorder, etc. So, of course, there is often in these sources even an embellishment of reality, which is kind of obvious also because these works were following some literary, they're not literally scientific treatises, but what they say, right, is meaningful. The way they say it can be, like, of course, simply a consequence of their own times, but still, right, the fact that we objectively learn of the same about combat psychology today from veterans, but just from just, again, the universal knowledge of it. If you have studied warfare, you just know these things without having gone to war yourself, which I wish, in fact, not to have witnessed. But let's say, in fact, that's the point, right? We know that it exists. We have arrived to the point which people do not even read or learn about this anymore. So, of course, being there and feeling it, it's something much worse, much more terrifying, but that's why we also been de-habituated to it. Like, there are things in our lives that can strike us in different way because moral resources are really, unpredictable, say uncontrollable, right, in the reactions that can, because you may never know how something is gonna affect you, right? But warfare is so heavy and brutal and intense that you start recognizing that trial, right, put on yourself, the cost, the toll, in a way on its own, that is really the ABC of warfare in every single step of the way. Imagining for a lifetime spent in war, like this man literally lived. So that gives the dimension, right? How much moral force was needed compared to anything you can have personally gone through. Unless you were you experienced warfare, extremely powerful traumas in a sense, but the importance of warfare in this is that it had a logic, right? It's not an accident happening to you, right? In warfare, that happens, but it's a wanted accident very often. Okay, these people died often of illness rather than of wounds. But it's not that the latter was a rare eventuality at all. So there was an harmony in which war was handled, in a sense, right? Some call it chivalry in the sense that they say, well, the elite tended not to kill each other too much. Well, especially during the 100 Years' War, really, a cannonball doesn't really look at your rank, let me tell you. But aside from that, that may have been, of course, irrelevant in the broader amount of ways people got killed. But in general, we're talking about let's say, a way of fighting that is also and always, of course, mixed with a political action. So that war, as von Clausewitz teaches us, is never absolute. That is to say, it's never unrestrained. It's not a pure, direct explosion of war, right? There is always a reason why people make war, for a reason or another. Everybody has their own reason, right or wrong. Morality, in this sense, doesn't count. What in a description of war, what counts is that you will never see, let's say, full war at the utmost. So that it's not much of the degree of war itself, it's what it's compensated by. And these knights were, of course, politicians, were, businessmen by a certain degree. War was a business in itself. So even warfare, think about tournaments as well, right? There were games in which people broke their bones, some even died. I mean, it was a way to still promote themselves for another purpose. So warfare wasn't the purpose, but it was still seen as the school of men, the school of those who had to lead, who had to control, because it was, in a world like that, was so unpredictable, etc. Also because of war, but mainly because of politics, as always. The moment in which somebody could get the best control on themselves, because if they didn't, couldn't simply handle war. And that's all, in fact, what properly the stigma attached to cowardice stems from, right? Being lenient towards weak people is good up to a certain point, because why are those people weak in the first place? Like, aren't they human beings like all the others? Can't they take kind of stressful things? We're pathologizing everything in terms of mental dimension, mental stripes, mental issues. But let's say, don't we realize that sometimes what happens is the consequence of a mishandling of something that was somebody's fault or responsibility, and very often also the same individual's fault or responsibility. And the more we comment, we simply say, well, it's not your fault about anything. Things happen, right? Just look on psychology, in random internet pages, right? Not by psychologists or clinical psychologists, but the average, person. But even in that environment, but like in others, this is a bit the leniency of leftism in a sense, spreading everywhere. Don't worry, this thing happens. You just have to wait, it will go away. Like nobody tells you, like, try to understand why this happens. No, you're just one of the many. It just happens. It's just, it's like, like weather changing. You shouldn't worry about what's happening in your head, right? Because, it just happens. There's no reason. You teach a person not to persecute moral forces. What kind of person do you make it, right? I'm Wally. I've suffered too. Mentally, I think not in a pathological sense, but it depends, because even in there, it's a matter of convention. What is pathological or not? And even though it was hard, and surely I needed some, support in a broader, loyal sense, but I wouldn't cry on myself saying, I'm such a victim of this world. No, I knew what was happening. I knew everything, and it was my own reaction causing that. And I could handle the things differently, or maybe just shit happens, like in that case, and I had to get through it, right? And after that, I feel stronger, as a matter of fact, which is very interesting, because yes, you feel you maybe lost something, but you got something else. And that was just kind of a sentimental strain, by the way. So not even like you get terminal cancer, how do you live the rest of your life, right? That's really a question I wouldn't like to answer, but that happens too. How do we put that? I know people are around me with with cancer. So what about them? I know that they're going through something terrifying. And when I study war, because that's what I do for a living, and I realize what war is and how it's fought and whatever, you realize that there are some implications there that you can't simply go pass around by saying, war is wrong, whatever it happens, right? It's politics really that messes up things, that people make war for stupid reasons, or because they can't calculate things, or because their culture is too stupid to realize not to attack a country, without any decisive numerical superiority, without having even properly realized what that country can put up against you. Well, those are the bad things, and those actually are pretty good civilizational thermometer to understand who's just, an underdeveloped moron, and who has an intelligence and a capacity. And so I think that without military history, you can't really see the world in the same way you will see any other thing. And these are considerations, of course, we made mostly when we studied von Clausewitz, that we will have to fall back on, let's say, soon, because that's precious and necessary and beautiful to read and study, because it teaches these very things. Many people come here in my videos at this point thinking that I talk about the Middle Ages. This is a YouTube channel about, those kind of things. How did they, how were forests in the Middle Ages? Oh my God, this is such a deep political, cultural problem. Or, how this, type of detail or technicality, what tools they used to cultivate, to work the land. Oh my God, it was such a complex thing. It's so different. And nobody gives a damn about, the single most important things in humanity that are essentially moral. Moral in this very concrete fashion that we described today. I'm a Clausewitzian, I'm a military historian. And yes, I'm also a medievalist. But in this sense, I'm more like, I want to see myself as an amateur of the art of war, if anything. And I care very much to deliver the best explanation I can come personally up with. Right, that's what I do. So, and speaking of the military art, to conclude, there is the author Molinet that uses the expression in these terms, militating art, right, which approximates, in fact, the expression, the military art, right? And there is a Latin proverb that says vivere militare est, which means living is to fight, essentially, is to be in arms. And that's pretty much spot on, right? And so medievals read the Romans, knew what those phrases meant, right? Much better than we do, by having a much broader historical knowledge of ancient Rome than the medievals had. But the medievals were much closer to understanding the meaning of what even those proverbs would mean for a Roman back in the day than we do, and that we do about medieval warfare in the same time. So the art of war appears as a term already towards the mid-16th century, for example, in the French translation of Robertus Valturius, who was an Italian military engineer, very famous one. Also, basically everybody had studied Valturius. There was De Re Militari. He worked for the Malatesta in his native Rimini. Valturius De Re Militari was possessed in copy by the King of France, Louis XI, the King of Hungary, Matthias Corvinus, the Duke of Urbino, Frederick of Montefeltro, the Lord of Florence, Lorenzo de' Medici, and even Leonardo da Vinci had a copy of him. At least he quotes him in his work extensively. And this can be found in the French translation, if I'm not wrong, of 1555 to Les 12 livres de Robert Volturon touchant la discipline militaire translatée de la langue latine en françoise par Loi Maigret. It's written in a, antiquate French, so probably also this par Loi Maigret of Lyon, but it was published in Paris, 1555. And in fact, the first chapter, the first book, deals with properly the first and the second source of the military art, right? That as a military engineer, Bartholomew was taking quite importantly in consideration. That we will maybe make a video once about in a kind of more theoretical sense. All right, so for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.